So again, I'm Kari O'Connell. I'm the principal investigator of the Undergraduate Field Experience Research Network, and we're happy today to have, I think it's our 6th speaker in our webinar series on 21st century field education. And just to give you a super brief background about the UFERN project, the Undergraduate Field Experiences Research Network, and it's funded through the National Science Foundation. It's a research coordination network project that focuses on building a collaborative network that fosters effective undergraduate field experiences. Our main goal is to build an open, inclusive network and provide ways for everyone to be involved, to both contribute and learn something. And that's one of our major goals for this webinar series. So I want to announce first our next webinar, and I'll have this up again at the end, is April 10th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And it's actually going to be myself and my colleague Kelly Hope and Michael Giamolaro here at Oregon State. And we're going to be presenting a framework that is going to be a pretty interactive session where we'll want to actually get everyone's feedback. So watch out for that, and we'd love to see you all there. I just want to start with a couple webinar logistics. All of you as participants are muted, so we won't be able to hear you. So please use the chat at the bottom of the screen. That's how I did email out saying, wait a minute, we're having technical difficulties. You're welcome to share resources with each other, websites, any other comments you want to put, and we can save those and post them online for later. We'll have Alison give her seminar and then allow time for questions at the end, and you'll be able to enter questions into the Q&A box. You can do it at any time, and then I'll facilitate the questions at the end of the webinar. We are going to do a super quick poll before we get started. So we'll just ask you to take just a couple minutes to answer these questions. The first one is about how did you hear about the webinar today, and the second one is about your area of expertise. We gave you some examples. If you don't feel like you fit into any of those choices, please just type into the chat what your area of expertise is. We just like to know who's in our audience. And while you're doing that poll, just want to mention that this webinar is being recorded and we'll post it online to be archived, and you can go back to it later at any time. So should I just keep going?
Close out the poll themselves. Yeah,
and just one kind of logistics note, when you've taken the two questions on the poll, you'll want to hit exit to make sure it clears off your screen and you can still see your slides. So with that, I'm going to introduce our webinar speaker, and we really appreciate her calling in at kind of an not as usual time for her. She's calling from the UK, and we had some time zone challenges, so we're really appreciating her right now, just jumping in, maybe at a different time than she originally thought. So our speaker is Alison Stokes. She's a lecturer in Earth and Environmental Science Education in the School of Geography, Earth and Environmental Sciences. And she is also the co-lead of Diversity in Geoscience UK, and which is a UK chapter of the International Association for Geoscience Diversity. Her expertise is in fieldwork pedagogy, and her current research is focused around access and inclusion in the geosciences. And we're going to hear more about that. So Alison, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and now it will be your turn. So you should be able to share your PowerPoint, just the PowerPoint alone, I would say.
Okay.
Not your whole screen.
Okay. Am I sharing anything yet? Okay. Okay, is that sharing my screen? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Oh, we can hear you. Okay.
So it's me, I can't hear.
Hi, I'm trying to share my screen. I've got no idea if people can hear me or if you can see my screen or not. No. Okay, well, I'm just going to go ahead and start and assume that you can all see and hear me making an idiot of myself. I'm Alison Stokes, and I'm going to be talking about one of my current areas of research, which is about making fieldwork accessible and inclusive for students with disabilities. I will be talking specifically about disability, but I would say that arguably if we make fieldwork accessible and inclusive for students with disabilities, then we go an awful long way towards making it accessible and inclusive for all of our students. I'm just going to swap those views. I think that might work better. Okay. So, hang on a minute. Okay, for God's sake. Oh, okay, that's better. So here's a schedule of my talk. First of all, I'm going to talk about why it's so important for fieldwork to be accessible and inclusive, and then I'm going to go on to discuss 2 case studies relating to fieldwork that I'm currently involved with. So there's the Sea to Sky Highway field trip and Access Anglesey. When I've talked about those, I'll review what it is that we've learned, and then at the end I'm going to talk about what still needs to change. And as Carrie said, there will be some opportunity for questions and answers at the end. So just to clarify that I will be talking about the students' experiences and barriers to students' experiences. I'm not going to be discussing faculty experiences in this particular field trip. I'd just like to acknowledge my collaborators before I go any further. So case study 1 was run by the International Association for Geoscience Diversity. That was funded by the National Science Foundation and Society for Exploration Geophysics. And case study 2 was, that's being run through the Inclusive STEM project in the UK. That's funded by the UK Office for Students. The main the lead on that particular project is the Open University, and the collaborators are the Universities of Leeds and the University of Plymouth. We have IRB approval for all the research that I'm going to talk about. We have consent to use the photos that I'll be showing. And when I present some student quotes later in the talk, I will be using pseudonyms rather than their real names. Okay. So the first question that I really want to address is why is it so important to consider access and inclusion in fieldwork? Well, the big issue is that we know that there is a global shortage of STEM professionals, and we would count geoscience within that. So what we really need to be looking to do is to attract a much wider range of talent into the STEM disciplines, including geoscience. Now that diversity of talent covers quite a broad range. It would include gender, it would include socioeconomics, but it does also include disability. And we know that there are barriers to students with disability engaging with fieldwork. So on that basis, if we're going to improve access and inclusion to geoscience education in general, then fieldwork is a really important component of that. So looking at data from within the UK, and this goes back over a decade now, we can see that there's been a steady increase in the proportion of students declaring a disability within higher education. So at the moment, we have just over 12% of all students and just over 10% of first year students or freshmen who are declaring a disability. And that has, that has over doubled over the past decade. So we know that we have an increasing proportion of students, an increasing proportion of students who are coming into higher education declaring a disability. So these are then data from students that are enrolled on physical science programmes. And what these data show us is that the majority of students who are following physical science programmes declaring a disability are declaring what we would term an unseen disability. So this includes things like social learning difficulties, so that would be dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, mental health conditions, long-standing illness or health conditions, so this would be things like maybe asthma, diabetes, cancer, HIV, and also social communication and autistic spectrum disorders. And this is really important because what this means is that the majority of disabilities that students in physical sciences, and this will include geoscience, are disclosing are conditions that are unseen. And this presents some quite interesting challenges when it comes to fieldwork. So why is this important? Well, our data are telling us that students that disclose a disability are less likely to progress through to the end of their degree programme. So they're actually less likely than students without disabilities to complete their undergraduate studies. If they complete their undergraduate studies, our data are telling us that they're less likely to attain a first-class degree and more likely to attain a lower second-class and a third-class degree. So we're seeing this attainment gap in terms of student success, in terms of the class of degree that they achieve.
Alison,
yes,
I am really sorry to interrupt, but can you put your PowerPoint on presentation mode? Because we're only seeing the first slide. And again,
oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. I thought
that's okay. This is so hard, and we were all scrambling. And I know. Thank you for your patience, everyone. It was one of those kinds of craziness.
Okay, I'm so sorry. I thought my screen is showing that it's on presentation mode. So yeah. Okay, listen, do you want me?
Everyone, usually we have time to do all this beforehand, and we're really sorry about this.
Do you want me to start again? I can just flick really quickly through the slides that you would have missed.
Sure.
Perfect.
Okay. So first of all, Carrie, can you tell me what you're seeing?
I'm seeing the very first slide, knowing that there's going to be a, like your title slide.
Okay, but you can't see my notes.
But it's not in presentation mode.
Okay, that's fantastic. That's exactly where I want to be. So, okay, so this was my overview. These were some images of fieldwork that I was going to show, which just really demonstrates that the images that we see are not necessarily presenting fieldwork in a way that is visibly accessible and inclusive. These are my data that show that we have an increasing proportion.
I'm really sorry, we're still not seeing them.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
It's showing that it's showing that I've shared my screen. I've got a tag at the top of my screen.
Are you sharing your whole screen or just the PowerPoint?
I've just clicked.
Share and then share just the PowerPoint. There's there should be options to choose, like little windows.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well. Oh, it's this. Yeah, we've had this before. We can see why does fieldwork need to be inclusive and accessible now, which is what you were just talking about. So if you don't mind that people can see your notes, we could make like this, but I would say just end slideshow and restart it again.
Okay, so hang on a minute. Right, let me just shut my PowerPoint down completely. Okay. So can you tell me now, Carrie, what you can see? Can you see PowerPoint or can you see PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, yes. So now advance one and see. I can see the first page.
Okay, so now if I put it into presentation mode, what can you see?
We see your notes. I would say go back to the last one that you did and just advance it that way. I think that's okay. I think everyone can deal with that.
What can you see now?
Oh,
Perfect.
it's great. It worked. Okay. And I'll just let you know, we might run a little late with questions. We want to give her time to take a deep breath and get through her presentation. So it might
Oh,
be
goodness
if
me.
people need to go, right at 11, that's fine. And we'll let it run a little bit late for questions. So thank you to you, Alison, and everyone else. I'll let you get started again.
Okay, so I'll go back to where I started presenting my data. This is just a trend line that shows that within the UK, for well over a decade now, we've seen an increasing proportion of students with disabilities coming into higher education. These are the data that show that the majority of conditions that students are presenting with are unseen conditions. These are the data that show that students with a disability are less likely to progress through to the end of their degree. These are the data that show that students with disabilities are less likely to attain a higher class of degree. And I believe this is where I'd got to, which is these are data showing that when students graduate, students with a disability are less likely to go into full-time professional work and more likely to go into part-time work or to be unemployed. So the summary there is that we know the proportion of students entering HE declaring a disability is increasing. These students are less likely to complete their studies, they're less likely to gain a good degree, and they're less likely to enter full-time professional employment. So what this means is that by not making our undergraduate geoscience education inclusive, we're actually putting students with disabilities at a disadvantage in terms of their ability to succeed. And as fieldwork is a major component of geoscience education, if we're aiming to make geoscience ed accessible, then the implication is that we have to make fieldwork accessible. So the main barriers to fieldwork, well, we know that we have physical and logistical issues. These were looked at in quite a lot of detail by Hall and Healy. So this would cover things like physical mobility, negotiation of fieldwork sites, removal from familiar environments, the need to make adjustments, and issues around reading and note-taking. Cook et al. Came to a very important conclusion at the end of their study, which was that by making accommodations for students with disabilities, this did not impact on the academic merit of the fieldwork. And I think that's an issue that, well, that's something that's of issue to some faculty members. If we make these accommodations, it doesn't necessarily mean that academic rigour is compromised. We're also increasingly recognising that social inclusion is very significant in terms of fieldwork. So this is about helping novice geoscientists to cultivate their identity and to think and practice like professional geoscientists. And what we're interested in our accessible fieldwork is how it can help to foster social connectivity among both students and faculty through interaction and through collaboration. So hopefully, finally, that set the context for the work that I'm going to talk about. So this is the first of my case studies, which is the Sea to Sky Highway. This took place in Vancouver in 2014. It was run by the IAGD, and the aim was to conduct an accessible field trip, which started to explore these accessible methods of field instruction. So this was a single-day excursion that was run in collaboration with the 2014 GSA annual conference, which was in Vancouver, and it was delivered as a a workshop-style single-day field trip that was based on a field trip that's been designed and developed by Brett Gilley at University of British Columbia. So Brett worked very closely with Chris Atchison from the IAGD to develop and modify this field trip to make it accessible to learners with a range of disabilities. So the day involved visiting 5 different locations along Highway 99, which is the Sea to Sky Highway, and undertaking a range of observation-based activities which allow participants to explore different types of geology and geological settings. So what this provided was the opportunity for students and faculty to work together, to exchange experiences and knowledge, and to start to explore some of the principles for making fieldwork accessible and inclusive. So here's our group and field, and in terms of who took part, we had 15 students, undergraduate and graduate. We had 14 geoscience faculty, 2 instructors, so this was Chris Atchison and Brett Gilly. We had 2 participant researchers, so I was working with Dr. Anthony Faig from Central Michigan. We had a sign language interpreter and 1 member of our support team who was also working as a photographer. So of our 29 participants, 17 self-identified as having a physical, neurodiverse or mental health condition. And the term neurodiverse simply refers to differences in the way that the human brain functions. So it's recognising that different people process information in very different ways. So this will incorporate conditions such as ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia and autism. And of those 17 participants who disclosed a disability, 14 of those were within the student cohort. So in terms of the research, what we were trying to investigate were the experiences of students and faculty participating in accessible fieldworks. So Anthony Faig focused very much on the faculty, and the findings from that research have literally just been published in a paper, and I will give you the references for that at the end. And the student experiences are being published in a paper which is currently, well, the revised version is currently in review, so hopefully that will be published later this year. So the sorts of questions that I was interested in exploring, we were using pre and post fieldwork focus groups and in situ observation, were to do with the fieldwork design, how the development of learning communities can be promoted through accessible fieldwork, and how this can then support and promote self-advocacy among student cohorts. So before we went in the field, I was really keen to find out from the student participants about their prior experiences of fieldwork and their expectations for their forthcoming fieldwork. And the prior experiences that they reported were not universally negative by any means. They actually talked about a lot of very positive prior experiences. But some of the terms and phrases that were emerging from the discussion highlighted some of the issues and barriers that these students had previously faced. And it was really important that we knew about these, because if a student's previous experience of fieldwork is that they're perceived as lazy, or they feel misunderstood or unsupported, there's a very high likelihood that they will carry those expectations over with them to their subsequent fieldwork. And obviously we didn't want this to happen. But when I actually spoke to the students, what emerged is that they'd actually modified their expectations on the kind of the knowledge and understanding that the fieldwork they were participating in was designed to be accessible and inclusive. So they were expecting that the physical and the kind of the attitudinal factors would be very different, that there would be multiple ways of engaging with the geology and multiple ways of accessing the learning, and that the learning environment would be inclusive both socially and academically. So actually they were setting their expectations fairly high. Once we got in the field, there was a very, very strong focus throughout the day on building this social connectivity. So first of all student participants were teamed with a member of faculty. So we had these student-faculty buddy pairs. And the real advantage of this was that every student knew that, first of all, throughout the day, there was one person who would be looking out for them. And from the get-go, there was somebody who they could talk to about their experiences and who they could share knowledge with. But the way that the activities was designed was such that throughout the day, we were looking for evidence that these buddy pairs were kind of rippling out through greater interaction, and there was more collaboration and more connectivity throughout the whole group. And this, in fact, is what we did observe, which was really great. We saw more knowledge sharing, more interactions and more collaboration. And this collaborative learning and social inclusion are both really good signs that the group were beginning to form kind of a learning community. This is something that we were kind of really hoping to see. In terms of physically accessing the geology, it wasn't about getting every participant nose up to every outcrop, because we knew that that wasn't going to be possible. But it was about enabling all of the participants to engage with the learning activities at every outcrop. And offering multiple means of access, which meant that people had a choice in how they access the geology, was a really important way of achieving this. So we know that students with disabilities can have kind of physical, or can encounter physical barriers to accessing the geology, but they can also encounter challenges to engaging with the learning materials and the learning resources around accessible fieldwork. So it was really important to develop learning materials that that enabled students to engage in different ways and to apply different senses. So first of all, the written handouts that the students were provided with were much richer in detail and information than might normally be expected on a field trip. There was an audio guide that was developed to enable students to listen to instructions kind of hourly using the sense of hearing. And also these tactile maps were developed. So this is where the spatial geology was kind of identified using, on the left-hand side, we've got different textures of puff paint, and on the right-hand side, we've got different grades of sandpaper. And this is really great for our visually impaired students, so they were able to get this sense of spatial distribution and also identify where the different locations were relative to each other. So going back to the expectations then, I said that the participants had been kind of quite hopeful in their expectations. At the end of the field trip, what we were really keen to find out is whether their experiences had kind of lived up to those expectations. And by and large, we found that was the case. So certainly for the student participants, what they told us is that a lot of the pressures that they'd previously encountered on fieldwork, they hadn't encountered on this fieldwork. So very much the pressure was off. They felt that everybody had been included and that the pace of delivery of the activities was right. So the timing was such that everybody could feel included, and there was sufficient flexibility as well. They felt that the social interaction that we'd aimed for had been successfully facilitated, and a critical outcome from this was that what we saw was the beginnings of this new learning community of students and faculty who would now be willing to advocate for accessible and inclusive fieldwork in the future. So a key outcome from this Sea to Sky Highway field excursion was the emergence of some characteristics of inclusive and accessible fieldwork. So we've got multiple means of access. So finding locations where participants can access the geology through different means, and also through using their different senses. So making the learning materials available in a range of different formats. We need to make sure that the pace and timing is appropriate so that everybody can engage with the learning and that there's flexibility in the schedules. We need to make sure that the learning activities are collaborative, so there's sufficient interaction between students and their peers, and also between students and faculty. This is really critical in terms of developing learning communities. We also need to make sure that we focus on academic as well as physical rigour. So making sure that wherever the learning is located physically, there's opportunities for everybody to stay involved. And also making sure that self-advocacy is promoted, so inviting students to make their needs known and making sure that they know that their voices are heard. Okay, so this is what emerged from the Sea to Sky Highway field trip. What we now needed to do was to test these characteristics in a more robust setting. So this is where our next case study, Access Anglesey, comes in. Okay. Access Anglesey took place in September 2018, and it was delivered as part of the Inclusive STEM project, which is running until the end of August in the UK. The lead institution is the Open University, with partners the Universities of Leeds and Plymouth. And Access Anglesey was designed and delivered primarily by Doctors Jackie Houghton and Dan Morgan from the University of Leeds. And the aims were very similar to the Sea to Sky Highway. It was to continue developing and exploring methods to support access and inclusion in the field, and to further develop and share good practice. So in terms of who took part, well, this field trip was made available to any undergraduate student studying at a UK university on a geoscience or related programme, including those for whom fieldwork can be a challenge due to mental health, neurodiverse or mobility issues. So in the end, we had 12 undergraduate and 1 graduate student from 9 institutions. We had 1 carer companion, 3 participant observers, so the field trip was also open to faculty from other institutions who were interested in learning about accessible fieldwork, 2 instructors, which was Jackie Houghton and Dan Morgan. We had 2 technical experts. I was working with Chris Atchison as a participant researcher, and we also had 2 full-time demonstrators. The main difference between the Sea to Sky Highway and Access Anglesey is that Access Anglesey was a week-long residential field course. And this took place in the Anglesey area of Wales. So on the map of the UK there, we've got a little red rectangle. This is Anglesey, and it covers an area of, I think it's about 270 something square miles. And over the course of the week, we visited a range of different locations. And this gave students the opportunity to access geology ranging from Neoproterozoic through to Carboniferous, and a range of geological settings from subduction zones all the way through to Carboniferous sediments. So over the course of the week, through engaging in a range of different learning activities, the students were able to build up knowledge and understanding about the geological evolution of the Anglesey area. So the aim was really to reflect as far as possible a typical undergraduate field trip, and this would mean that the findings that emerge from this would be as widely applicable as possible. As with the Sea to Sky Highway, the aim was not to get everybody right up close to every outcrop. We knew that wouldn't be achievable. It was about making sure that everybody was engaged with the learning at every location. So the locations that we did visit were chosen primarily for their geology, with the accessibility kind of being the secondary consideration. In terms of the data collection, we were collecting data from all participants. So this was not just the students, but also the faculty members that were involved, and also our participant observers. We had pre and post fieldwork surveys for the students. We conducted in situ observation of the field activity, and we also undertook post fieldwork surveys both immediately after the fieldwork, and we're currently doing follow-up interviews with the student participants. So in the following discussion, what I'll be doing is taking you through different aspects of the fieldwork design, and interspersing this with some of the quotes and survey data that give an insight into the impact of this accessible fieldwork on the students' experiences. So just to run through the logistics first of all, we stayed in hostel accommodation, so there were either shared or single occupancy rooms. This was full board and it was fully catered for. And the hostel also provided us with a quiet room. So this is somewhere where the students could go and sit quietly on their own if they just felt the need to kind of take some time out. And this is particularly important for autistic students. We had self-drive vehicles, including a 4x4, and this was used by our mobility impaired students, both of whom were wheelchair users. And we were able to use this vehicle with landowners' permission to get these students up close to the outcrops in as many locations as possible. We spent either a whole day or a half day at each locality. So the field trip was designed to spend more time at fewer locations. And there was about an hour set aside each evening for a debrief to set the day's work into context. And then the students were free to use the downtime however they wished. So before we went in the field, Jackie Houghton had a Skype conversation with the students with disabilities, again to find their expectations for the field trip and to talk about what had worked for them on previous field trips and what support they might need on the Access Anglesey field course. And what became very clear is that a schedule for each day which gave detailed instructions about what to expect at each locality was really important. So rather than having one big kind of handbook that was given to the students at the beginning of the week that they kind of consistently referred to, a separate handout was developed for each day of the field trip. So the students were given a separate handout each morning. And this contained, or the front sheet had a detailed schedule for the day. It showed where the locations were that we would be visiting and where these locations sat in relation to the geologic timescale. So the schedule itself, we left the hostel at 9 AM and returned between 4 and 5. The schedule made very clear that there would be a specific lunch break at some point within the day. And it was particularly important for autistic students to know that there would be a point within the day where we would stop the field activity and spend that time to have a lunch break. With any field work, of course, we need to be flexible. So there was also an understanding among everybody that at some points, we may need to change the schedule, for example, depending on what the weather did. And we all know that uncertainty is a characteristic of all the field work that we do. So everybody was very understanding of that. When we got in the field, the diversity of the student cohort meant that there was a range of communication requirements that we needed to address. So we used a range of technologies to communicate in the field. We used a tour guide system to communicate with the students as a group. So this is where the main speaker has a microphone and a transmitter. So the middle photograph here is Jackie Houghton, and then all the participants have an earpiece and a receiver. So this is one of our participant observers, and the earpiece was interchangeable with people's personal headphones. So the students could use their own headphones if they chose to. We found that wind noise was a particular problem fairly early on. So luckily, one of our participant observers had a microphone cover. Now this solved the wind noise problem brilliantly, but it also meant that the tour guide system henceforth became known as chinchilla radio, based on the resemblance of the microphone to a dead chinchilla. Always good for group cohesion and morale to have a running joke, we found. It was more problematic to maintain communication with the students in the 4x4 vehicle, depending on where they were located relative to the other participants. If they were sufficiently close to the rest of the group, then we could use the tour guide system. Otherwise, we could use walkie-talkies to allow them to maintain one-to-one dialogue with the field trip leader. There was also a live feed system which was working off a local area network. Now this did take some time to set up, but when it worked, it was absolutely fantastic, because what it did was to enable the students that were remotely located in the vehicle to see in real time what was happening at the outcrop, and they were also able in some instances to direct some of the field activity. We also tried Skype and FaceTime at one location where we couldn't set up a local area network, but we had 4G. That didn't work quite as well. But the main priority was to try to maintain two-way contact and two-way conversation with our remotely accessed students for as much of the time as we possibly could. So in terms of the tour guide, when we spoke to the students at the end of the field course, they all commented on how useful they'd found this. And this was particularly the case for autistic students, because one of the issues that autistic students face is that they can find it difficult to be crowded in with other students. So this would typically be at the end of a briefing, and they can also be very distracted by background conversations and by background noise. So this is a quote from Frank. He was our graduate student who is also autistic, and he found the tour guide system extremely useful. What this photograph is showing, you can see the 4x4 vehicle, and Dan Morgan is actually sat inside the vehicle with our mobility impaired students, giving the briefing to the remainder of the group. And you can just see how spread out they are, but because they've all got their earpieces in, they can all hear perfectly clearly the information that he is relaying to them. So yeah, tour guide systems are fab. So as well as maintaining communication with the students in the 4x4, it was really important that they were given activities to do that allowed them to stay involved with the wider group activity. Okay, so they were given activities that allowed them to contribute to the wider data gathering. So there were a series of activities that were developed that involved hand specimens, photographs from outcrops, photomicrographs from thin sections, and also polished hand specimens. And this enabled the mobility impaired students, when they were sat in the car, to compile this additional data set that they could feed into the students that were located at the outcrop. And what's really important about this is that it allows the remotely accessed, remotely located students to bring a unique perspective and to really contribute something to the wider group activity. And this is hugely important in terms of community building through shared tasks and common goals. They're not just there for the sake of being there. And all of the hand specimens and the thin sections from which the photomicrographs were taken were made available to the whole group during the evening back at the hostel. We also took some tablets in the field to offer all of the students an alternative to the traditional field notebooks that they're used to using. So we had 2 iPads and 2 Android tablets, and these were preloaded with apps for note-taking and geological mapping. So most of the students did actually have a go with the tablets at some point during the fieldwork, and the results were mixed. I think all students could appreciate the value of having tablets available, but a lot of them, particularly those that didn't have a disability, really expressed a preference just to stick with their notebook and pencil because that's what they were useful and it worked for them. Where the tablets proved to be particularly helpful was for our neurodiverse students. So there's 2 quotes here from Callum and Daryl. Both of these students are autistic, and both were given tablets at the beginning of the field course. They were different types of tablet, and they had different types of app on them, but both students found ways to make the tablet work for them. And I think it's fair to say that using a tablet was transformative in the sense that it enabled them to record their field information and engage with the fieldwork in a way that they hadn't previously been able to do, which was absolutely fantastic. Some important learning points for the instructors were that it's good to be familiar with these tablets before going in the field, and also that different apps will work for different people. So I mentioned previously about pace and timing and how important this seems to be in relation to accessible fieldwork. And again, we found this was definitely the case with our neurodiverse students. Now, all of the students commented at the end of the field trip on the relaxed pace of the fieldwork and how nice it had been to have this time to really explore and spend some time just listening rather than worrying maybe about assessment. But for the neurodiverse students, it was particularly important because it can take longer for them to process information that's given in the field. And they had that time and that space to process the information. So these are quotes from Beth, who has ADHD, and from Frank, who is autistic. Now, we know that students can lack confidence in the field, so we were really interested to see if, jumping ahead, if inclusive and accessible fieldwork can increase their confidence in carrying out activities in the field and also in answering questions that are put forward by faculty. And what we found is that although obviously the caveat here is that we had a very small student sample, but we did find that there was an increase in positive responses at the end of the field trip, so that's great. We were recording that our students felt more confident in field activities and answering questions. And there's a really great quote here from Abby, who's one of our mobility impaired students, about the power of having multiple ways of accessing the learning and how this impacts on confidence. So not only did she have kind of the technology to keep engaged with the field activity, but there were thin sections, there were lots of people to talk to and explain things, there were the videos, and all of these helped to improve her confidence. We were also very keen to learn about the social inclusion. So there was unanimous agreement among the students at the beginning and the end of the field course about the importance of students and faculty working together. So this is really important in terms of this idea of building a learning community. We also found that after the field work, students were less likely to say that they felt excluded by their peers. However, we did find that some feelings of exclusion did persist. And what had emerged over the course of the field trip is that social inclusion is particularly complex for students with neurodiverse conditions, and this is both within the field and during downtime. So this is something that we didn't quite get right, and it's something that definitely does need some further attention. But I've also included here this quote from Callum, who is autistic. Callum had previously been excluded from residential fieldwork at his university with his own peer group on the basis of his autism. So this was his first time of being socially included in field activity with peers. So it was just really nice to hear from him that this had been a positive experience for him. We were also very keen to know whether our mobility impaired students had felt socially included, because for a lot of the time they were located in a vehicle and were therefore physically separate from the remainder of the group. And what Abby and Ed told us is that, yeah, the technology is great when it works, and it can really help them to feel that they are part of this kind of this whole group activity. However, what you can't beat is getting all of the students out to the outcrop and learning about geology together. That is the most powerful thing that they experienced. So, what have we learned from these experiences so far? There is no golden bullet to making fieldwork inclusive and accessible. A lot of the principles that I've talked about in terms of multiple means of access, different ways of engaging, about pace and timing, about interaction, about academic versus physical rigour, these are all elements of good pedagogic practice, and essentially they're probably things that we are already doing, but we could maybe do them in a slightly different way that means that our instruction is much more inclusive and accessible. Technology and alternative activities can be absolutely fantastic and very powerful, but at the end of the day, nothing beats getting all of those students out to the outcrop and learning together. Traditional fieldwork cultures can serve to exclude students. Now, I touched on this very briefly, and what I'm alluding to is some of the cultures around physical rigour, so this feeling that everybody has to get to the top of the mountain super quick, and also some of the cultures that students might engage with socially around drinking, for example. These can exclude certain types of student. But the thing is, when students feel included, they also feel empowered to advocate for themselves and others. So all students need to know that they have a voice and that their voice will be listened to. So what still needs to change? There's clearly still a lot more that we need to learn about inclusive and accessible fieldwork. But I do believe that we're starting to make progress, particularly in terms of the practicalities relating to fieldwork design and delivery. Where I think we still have some way to go is in terms of attitudes. We need to think differently about what it means for our fieldwork to be accessible and inclusive. And these different ways of thinking apply to students, they apply to faculty, they apply at institution level, professional bodies, industry, across the board. Because we need to stop thinking in terms of what isn't possible and what we can't do, and instead think about what we can do and embrace the range of possibilities that diversity presents to us. So I'd just like to leave everybody with this quote, which came from one of our Sea to Sky Highway participants. And this quote just encapsulates in a few words everything that I've been trying to say in the past 40 minutes, and why it is so important that we really think carefully about access and inclusion. Okay, so obviously there are loads of references and resources that I've got for you. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. Huge apologies for things being a little bit messy at the beginning. I hope you found this interesting, and I'm very happy now to answer any questions that people have. Thank you.
Alison, thank you so much. That was really great, and thanks for everyone's patience, but I was getting some emails and chats from specific people in the group, and they were just really excited to hear your great webinar. So we worked through our technical issues, right? and it was really great. And all of us on this webinar that has happened to all of us. So anyway, it was really great, and we appreciate it. And I know some people may need to leave, and that's fine. But I still want to allow some time for questions, and this whole thing will be recorded, including the questions, on our website. So if the questions are something you want to hear about later and you can't stay for now, that's fine. So I just encourage people to type in their questions into the Q&A box, and I will facilitate and call those out to Alison and help her manage those. So we already have one that I'm going to get started with, and the question is, for the tour guide system, did you have any hearing impaired students with a hearing aid? I've known people who have had trouble with that accents when lip reading with those systems.
Yeah, that's a really good question. On the Sea to Sky Highway field trip, we did have a hearing impaired student, but on Access to Anglesey we didn't. So we didn't actually encounter an issue with using the tour guide system for hearing impaired students. So I can't really comment on how well that would work.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read another question that was typed into the chat. And the question is, well, thank you for all of this. So I just encourage people to type in when the Q&A when they can. Oh, here we go. I found it again. I'm wondering what changes might be made to the Access Anglesey program if you'd had students with visual impairments. It seems as though all the activities were still reliant on visual cues.
Oh, that is a really interesting question. What we learned from the Sea to Sky Highway field trip that that was really interesting was how visually impaired students engage a wider range of senses when they're learning about geology, and the different understandings about the geology that this can bring to the learning activity. Now, this was something that came out on the Sea to Sky Highway because we did have visually impaired students. If we'd had visually impaired students on Access Anglesey, I think we could have engaged them in a similar way, because we could have, we could have got them up to the outcrop, and we could have got them engaging their senses in a different way, similar to the way that we did in the Sea to Sky Highway, and brought in this different level of insight and understanding that they would bring. So would we need to make any changes? I think maybe logistically, we would possibly need to make some changes to account for maybe how they physically access some of the locations. But I would like to think that they could still have engaged in the learning activities, but their insights that come from using a different range of senses, and what this tells us about learning geology, would have that would have really enhanced what we learned from that field trip. Does that make sense?
That person doesn't have a way to answer, but I'm going to say
Okay.
it does, because there are some other really great questions coming up as well. So I want to get a few more of those in. And one of them was a question I had myself as well. And Teresa asks, if you have limited resources, what would be the one or two things we could do to make our field experiences more accessible?
So would this be would this be human resources or physical resources? That's a tricky one. So things like the local area network, they are resource intensive in terms of time, and also there is a financial outlay. So that's probably not a good option if you are resource limited. I would say the tour guide system, that would be a really excellent resource to maybe look into. I think for the whole week, it cost us something like 500 UK pounds to hire. And I don't know what that equates to with dollars at the moment, but the student feedback from that was that it was just incredibly helpful for them, and that really helped them to stay engaged. I think with limited resources, the main thing is just to look to tweak ways in which the fieldwork is delivered and designed, because I think you're probably doing the right things anyway, but they could just be done slightly differently. Yeah, I think that would be my main answer. The tour guide system, and just looking at the design and delivery, and whether some of the practice could be delivered slightly differently.
Thanks, Alison. And I'm going to ask, well, I'm going to combine a couple questions on the Q&A, one from Alicia Farmer and one from Megan Brown, because I think they can kind of be answered similarly. And Megan actually asks, were the field experiences changed all at once? You knew who your participants were going to be. If so, do you have a timeline suggestion for having the participant information? And I can follow up a little bit more with Elisa's question, which just like, how much time did it take to plan for this kind of field experiences? Both of these questions are about, timeline and when you need the participant information to make all those changes.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about Access Anglesey because that's the one that I have the greatest knowledge about. So Access Anglesey, that was that would have been probably about 12 months in total in development, from kind of the very first stages right the way through to delivery, and that included at least two different visits to the field location for kind of reconnaissance and to identify the localities and to think about different issues around kind of physical access. We started to recruit for the field trip months in advance. And so the final information about who would be participating, that came in, I think, probably a couple of months before the field trip actually took place. So that was when we had a clearer idea about the range of disabilities that we would be accommodating. But also because we'd taken some of the principles from the previous inclusive and accessible field trip, we were fairly confident that the way that Access Anglesey had been developed, it would be inclusive and accessible to students with a range of disabilities. And the one constant between the Sea to Sky Highway and Access Anglesey was Chris Atchison from the IAGD, because he helped design and deliver the Sea to Sky Highway, and then he was also involved in developing Access Anglesey, so he could kind of apply his expertise in terms of the delivery. So it meant that when we knew who'd signed up to Access Anglesey, it was more a case of just making sure that we were absolutely clear about what exactly we needed to offer them in terms of support. And that did change fairly late in the day, because we were expecting some students to come to Access Anglesey who actually changed their plans at the last minute. So, you know, we were having to be quite flexible as well in terms of how we did things. Does that help? So it was a fairly long timeline, I would say up to 12 months from point of deciding it was going to be done and where it was going to be done through to actual delivery.
Thank you, Alison. I'm going to try to squeeze in like maybe 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up the webinar. Thanks, these are all great questions. There's a follow-up from Megan Brown related to what you just were talking about. She says, how much did you ask students to disclose? As far as their limitations, I think, is what she means.
Okay, so in order to answer that, I would have to go back and check the information they were asked to disclose. All of this information was collected by Jackie Houghton and Dan Morgan from the University of Leeds, because they were actually developing the fieldwork. We did ask the students to talk about their previous field experiences, and also we did ask them to be very open with them about the conditions that they had. And we did find that the information they gave us, they were very open and very clear about their requirements and about their individual conditions.
That might be something that we could follow up if people are interested in having that specific information. That could be something that we could post.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm very happy for anybody to email me individually for clarity on anything that I've talked about.
That's great. So, okay, we've got this question. I don't want to leave someone out who had asked, why is it preferable to use a daily handout on the field course rather than a handbook that students can look ahead with?
Okay, oh, this is a great question. So, so one of the reasons was that, well, the main reason was that we needed to, it needed to be very clear to the students what they were doing on each day and where they were going. And what we found is that if you give students a handbook that collates all of the information for the whole field trip, it just ends up staying in their rucksack and it's never taken out. Whereas if we gave students, and we've observed this on previous fieldwork, if we gave students a separate handout at the beginning of each day, they were more likely to keep referring to that. Now, that did work to a certain extent, but we did find a lot of the time that students were still leaving their handbook in the bottom of their bag. So one of the next things that we're going to try is reducing the size of the paper. So the answer is We split it up to giving students a handout every day because we felt that it focused them more on the day's activities, and they were less likely to either leave a book back at the accommodation or just leave it sitting in their rucksack. And we've now decided that yes, daily handouts are a better idea, but we need to reduce the physical size of them so that they're easier for students to use in the field. And they're also better for students who have neurodiverse conditions.
And then and we'll have one more question and then we'll end the webinar. I was trying to share a slide of like our website address and all of that. So I'll work on that during the last question. More technical issues. There we go. Yes, I know. So Nicole asks, were there field sites that you would have liked to visit but didn't because accommodations couldn't be made? Is a certain proximity to a city or town necessary, for example? And she just talks about that culture is problematic here because a lot of her own field training experiences relied heavily on rough camping and physical exertion.
Yeah.
What would be a good way to counter that attitude?
Okay, interesting question. So in terms of whether there were locations that were considered that were then discounted, again, I would need to defer that to my colleagues that actually developed the field trip. There may have been locations that they visited that then decided weren't appropriate. The great thing about the UK is that we're quite a small country, so you've actually got a better chance of being able to physically access a wider range of geology from being based in one location. And this is where Anglesey was so fantastic. As I said, we were able to access geology across a huge range of the geologic timescale and from a huge range of geological settings simply by being based in one location. How that would work in locations where you have to travel a long way to get to a field site, that's a really difficult one. I don't really know how to answer that is the honest answer. I think it would just be on a case-by-case basis, but also maybe really thinking about what you want from a location and rethinking what is possible and what learning a location might offer you that you maybe haven't considered before.
Thank you, Alison. So I just want to give, you can't hear us clapping, but we all are clapping. That was really great webinar, super informative. Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you who were able to join us today. Again, our next webinar is April 10th. And it's one a little more interactive with some framework that we're sharing about thinking about undergraduate field experiences around program design and